Unit 3, Complaining and Unbelief. The people forget the promises of God. All right, so if we look at our timeline again, we have now covered, of course, these events here, right, where we looked at where Moses flees Egypt, the Exodus, and where God gives him the law on Sinai, the Sinai covenant. And now we're going to start to move down into this next area, and there's going to be three really important events here during this time, the time of conquest, and that is, of course, where the spies enter Canaan, the time of the wilderness wandering, and then the conquest of Canaan itself. So what happens as we get into this? Of course, so the people begin to take preparations to go to the promised land. So in the book of Numbers, now that Exodus is done, we have the law, we have the tabernacle. Moses and Aaron now take a census of the people, and they organize them into these groups for service. We read this in the first 10 chapters of Numbers. After that, they travel from Mount Sinai to this place called Kadesh Barnea. And during this time, there's all kinds of complaining and struggle between Moses and Aaron and the people. But they finally arrive to Kadesh Barnea, and then Moses sends 12 spies into the land of Canaan to survey the land and come back and give a report of what they find. So as we look at this on the map, remember, we don't exactly know the location of Mount Sinai. It could be down there in the south, or it could be up there in the north. We don't know for sure, but we do know where Kadesh Barnea is, and it is, of course, right there. So if we look at this particular location, we can see it at this was kind of the beginning and end point of the time where the spies go into the land of Canaan. So if we start down there at Kadesh Barnea, we can kind of follow the route based on some of the specifics that we get in the book of Numbers of how they go up into the land of Canaan. They survey the land, and then they come back. They stop in Hebron, and then they come back to Kadesh Barnea, and they give a report. So what kind of report did they give about the land? Well, we read about it in Numbers 13, where it says, "Then they told him, and they said, 'We went to the land where you sent us. It truly flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit.'" They brought some with them, obviously. "Nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there." Now, this is an important little detail. And in fact, I want to pause here and I want to hop back to a verse that connects to this one, and that is Genesis 6:4. Now, if you remember when we talked about Noah, this verse was important because it said there were giants on the earth in those days and also afterward. And so this word giants is interesting because this is the Hebrew word nephil, or the plural being Nephilim. And this only occurs twice in the entire Bible. And it's an interesting word. The first place is, of course, in Genesis 6:4, where it talks about the giants that were in the land. But it also uses the same word a second time, and that is the word that we find here in Numbers 13:33, which we'll get to in a sec. But it says that we saw giants, and it says the descendants of Anak came from the giants. And they say, so we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. We'll get to that verse in a second. But what's interesting is that here we see the same thing that we saw in the days of Noah. And that is like there's some form, or there's a special class of people or giants who are in opposition to the plan of God. And so is Satan doing kind of the same thing that he did in the days of Noah here in the land of Canaan as they go to possess the land? Possibly. It doesn't say that, but we know that this word Nephilim is used in both cases. So if we go back to Numbers, we read the same verse, "Nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong, the cities are fortified and very large, and when we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the south, the Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the banks of the Jordan." But then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "Well, let us go up at once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it." But the men who'd gone up with him said, "We're not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we." And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land, of which they had spied out, saying, "The land which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw in it are men of great stature. And we saw giants." Here's our verse. "And we saw Nephilim. The descendants of Anak came from the giants." So we saw these giant people, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight. And so we also were in their sight. And so they go into the land. It's a great land, but they're terrified of the inhabitants there. And because of that, they give a bad report. And in Numbers 14, all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. And all the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron and the whole congregation of them. And they said, if only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in this wilderness. And so in our next unit, in Unit 4, this is really important because in our next unit, we're going to see what happens as a result of this complaining. So if you would, join me in Unit 4 as we look at the consequences of complaining and unbelief.